Hello. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our audience from around the world. My name is Andrew Hyde, and I'm a senior fellow and director in the Transforming Conflict and Governance program at the Henry L. Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. I will moderate today's discussion, which will look at whether in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the UN system is still fit for its intended role in the international system. I want to thank my Stimson colleagues, Richard Ponzio and Lisa Charlin, for their collaboration on developing today's session. While conflict has, unfortunately, been a steady feature on every continent since the current international system was established in the aftermath of World War II, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with its scale, intensity, and outsized ambitions, poses some fundamental challenges to the assumptions of generations and the current state of the international order. It upends established norms in international humanitarian law, human rights, humanitarian practice, and the political order. It could well represent the dawn of a new, much more dangerous and uncertain era. By some measures, the international response has been breathtaking and unprecedented in terms of widespread global condemnation, ratcheting comprehensive sanctions against Russia, a diverse and substantial supply of Russians to the Ukrainian military, and sudden ramping up of humanitarian assistance. But the question in front of us today is, what role has the UN system played, and whether it has been adequate and fulfills its international assumptions and expectations. No doubt the toolbox is there, but so are today's tough and sometimes intractable political realities. Of course, this is doubly highlighted today in a very timely development, where I note that Secretary General Guterres has just held a press conference this morning in Moscow with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, and the Secretary General leaves for Ukraine shortly. To help us make sense of this and to carry this important conversation forward, we have four panelists today who will provide diverse perspectives based on where they currently sit and the roles they have played in and around the United Nations. Let me introduce them together, and we will turn to them. First, Richard Gowan will provide a political overview and a focus on the primary UN bodies and how well they are responding to the conflict, especially given that it has been initiated by one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. In his day job, Richard oversees advocacy work for the International Crisis Group at the United Nations. In the past, he has worked with the European Council on Foreign Relations, New York University Center on International Cooperation, and the Foreign Policy Center in London. He has taught at Columbia and Stanford universities and worked in the past as a consultant for the UN. Next, Ambassador Keith Harper will speak about how the multilateral human rights system and structures have met the challenge and what should come next. Ambassador Harper, the first Native American to be named a US ambassador, served from June 2014 to January 2017 as the US representative to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. Ambassador Harper received his undergraduate degree from University of California, Berkeley, and his law degree from the New York University School of Law. He has had an impressive legal career and currently practices law in Washington, D.C., chairing his firm's Native American law practice. And then Dr. Kerry McDougall, joining us at a very late hour, thank you, Kerry, from Australia, will look at violations of international humanitarian and human rights law and focus on discussions underway to ensure accountability for such violations through the International Criminal Court and the options for a special tribunal on Ukraine. Dr. McDougall is currently a senior lecturer at the Melbourne School of Law, where she has been since 2018. Before joining the law school faculty, Dr. McDougall served as a legal advisor at Australia's UN mission, as her country's representative in the 6th Committee, and leading Australia's engagement on the responsibility to protect. Before her assignment to New York, she worked at the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, serving in the international law section, where she provided advice on international criminal law, international humanitarian law, the responsibility to protect, and the protection of civilians. She holds a PhD in international criminal law from Melbourne Law School at the University of Melbourne. Finally, rounding out our presentations and joining us shortly will be Ambassador Mikhail Milner, who will provide us with an insider's perspective from a frontline state to the conflict. Ambassador Milner has been Slovakia's permanent representative to the UN since 2017. Prior to this posting to New York, he served as Slovakia's ambassador to Kenya with accreditation to the UN Environmental Program and UN Habitat. He has held a number of distinguished positions at Slovakia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and from 2004 to 2009, he was Slovakia's Deputy Permanent Representative to the UN in New York, managing Slovakia's Security Council term. He holds a master's degree and a PhD in applied linguistics and teaching foreign languages from Comenius University in Bratislava. I will ask each panelist to provide about 5 minutes of initial observations. Then, exercising the moderator's privilege, I will follow with several questions to dig a bit deeper on pivotal issues raised in those presentations. I encourage all of you to paste your questions in the Q&A function on the chat screen, but because of the widespread interest in this topic and the size of today's audience, I will present a selection of those questions for the panelists to address. So to get us started, Richard, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. It's a privilege to be speaking with this group. It's also a little challenging for all of us because, I think it's too early to make any really insightful comments about what is happening with the Secretary General's trip to Russia. Crisis Group put out a piece about this on Sunday. I'm sending that to everyone in the chat, but I won't sort of try and do real-time analysis of what Guterres is doing in Moscow today. To zoom back out to the bigger picture, I want to start with a statement that I think may seem counterintuitive, which is that I believe that the UN system as a whole has actually responded rather well to this war. Now, that will seem counterintuitive because the central organ of the system, the Security Council, has clearly failed to respond to Russia's aggression because of Moscow sitting there with a veto power. But we always knew that the Council would not be able to play a significant role in the war, just as the Council was unable to play a significant role in 2014 for exactly the same reason, the Russian veto. If you look beyond the Council, however, I think that you can see that many other parts of the UN system are actually doing their best. The General Assembly has passed 3 resolutions on the war. 141 of the UN's 193 members backed a resolution condemning Russia. The General Assembly suspended Russia from the Human Rights Council, not by quite the same margin, but still with a pretty significant majority of those voting in favor of suspension. The Human Rights Council has launched a commission of inquiry into the war. Keith, I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about this, but we are quite optimistic that the commission can play a useful role because the Ukrainian government will give it access to sites of atrocities. That differentiates it from the long-running commission of inquiry on Syria, which has never been able to get into the country because Damascus won't give it access. If you look beyond that, the ICC is seized with this. You have over 1,000 UN staff on the ground involved in a humanitarian operation, which is expanding, although in many cases, humanitarian convoys keep running into obstruction or areas that are heavily mined. The system is actually doing its best. Even the Secretary General, who has been criticized for not going to Kiev or Moscow earlier, has actually been quite articulate on some of the other aspects of the war. He has actually been pushing the UN to think a lot about the food price shocks and the energy price shocks that are going to hit poor countries very hard as a result of the conflict. We know that UNCTAD and other bits of the UN system focused on development issues are actually working at a pretty good pace, doing assessments and contingency planning for the effects of food price shocks and energy price shocks. So the system as a whole, not doing that badly. But of course, you always come back to the Security Council. How is the Council doing? Clearly on Ukraine, it is failing appallingly. But again, there is some counterintuitive good news. The poison in discussions of Ukraine is not currently stopping the Council working on other files. Since the end of February, the Council has passed resolutions on Somalia, on South Sudan, on Yemen, and I think most importantly, passed an extremely significant resolution laying out the framework for future UN engagement in Afghanistan. There was a moment when it looked like Russia might veto that Afghan resolution, but Russia stepped back, in part, it seems, because of pressure from China. So the Council is still largely functioning, or no, I'd say largely functioning. It's as dysfunctional as it ever was on a lot of these other files. Now, the big question is, are we in a Wile E. Coyote moment? You know that Wile E. Coyote runs over the edge of the cliff, his legs keep spinning, and then after a few seconds, he looks down and drops. I think it is quite possible that, especially in the Security Council, we're in that sort of moment. The diplomatic tensions that are going to continue over Ukraine, or perhaps intensify, may make it harder and harder for the P5 to keep up deals on other issues. I think, for example, it's very unlikely that the Council will renew the mandate for cross-border humanitarian aid into Syria. This summer, that's a mandate that has always been worked out between the US and Russia. It may now fall apart. However, I mean, I think my overall summary of the situation would be that this war has oddly shown us that large parts of the UN system are functional and are relevant, but it is a system with a hole in its heart. And the hole in the heart is the Russian veto in the Security Council. And I do not see any realistic chance of getting rid of that veto. And as long as Russia continues on its current foreign policy course, that is going to loom over the UN in a very, very dark way.
Thank you, Richard, for that excellent overview and summary. I concur with your assessment that there's sort of a half glass, half full, half empty view of this, I think, in terms of looking at it. If I could turn now to Ambassador Keith Harper.
Well, thanks, Andrew, for having me. I appreciate the timeliness of this important conversation. Look, at the risk of being less interesting than if we were contentious, I largely agree with how Richard has framed the issue. The fact is that the Security Council, for reasons that are built into the system, has failed and will continue to fail on this. And I don't think there's any question about it. I mean, a P5 member, we've never had any idea that contrary notion that if a P5 member were to be the aggressor, that the system could work. But the other parts have really worked to the maximum extent to which they are built to work. If you look at the condemnation resolution, the first resolution, 141-5, with only the 5 members voting against it were Belarus, Russia, DPRK, Eritrea, and maybe Iran. I mean, all gross and systematic human rights abusers on their own. I don't think we should overlook the importance of that in the international conversation. And I would mention 3 things about not only why that vote was so important. The one is that the one thing the UN system is good at doing and can effectively do, and certainly the Human Rights Council did this in the beginning of the Syria conflict, but not as well as it's happened here, is to say who the international community thinks is right and who the international community thinks is wrong. And that's very, very important because it brings a moral benefit to and a condemnation to the country that is considered wrong by the entirety of the international community. And in an unprecedented vote of this nature, the message is crystal clear: who's right and who's wrong. The second reason why that comes to mind is it defines who's the pariah state and who should be the pariah state. And I think these resolutions and the multiplicity of the resolutions, and I hope they continue through special sessions and other means, and I think they will continue to say who is the pariah state, the Russian Federation. The third one that comes readily to mind is that, of course, the United States and the EU put on these crushing sanctions, appropriately, in my judgment, on Russia, that is having and has continued to ratchet those up. And with a vote like this, it gives greater justification to those sanctions because we know who is the pariah, we know who's the wrongdoer. So I think that initial vote was absolutely essential and really maximizes the power of the General Assembly. The HRC vote, 32-2, again, completely unprecedented, putting in place the heaviest medicine that the council has, which is a commission of inquiry. And we've seen in other contexts, such as the DPRK Commission of Inquiry, how this can fundamentally shift the conversation within the international community on a human rights abuse situation. And they will be able to report, as Richard points out, because they will be in country, so they will have a superior position than in other circumstances such as Eritrea, DPRK, Special Rapporteur in Iran. This Commission of Inquiry will have a lot more access, Syria, of course. And then going back to the General Assembly, the removal of the Russian Federation from the Human Rights Councils is also unprecedented. People point to the Libya example, but of course, in the Libya example, the ambassador from Libya changed sides. So that is a fundamental difference. This is what happened here is unprecedented, and the vote was also quite lopsided. Importantly there, remember that it was lopsided despite China coming out in vigorous opposition to the removal of the Russian Federation. So with China pushing against the resolution, it still won by a close to 2-1 margin. Of course, the elephant in the room is the Security Council. It's the one that has Chapter 7 powers. It is the one that is supposed to take action when you have a breach of international peace and security. And it is the one that is the failed institution. The difficulty with the Security Council, and we have to be counseled and with the failure of the League of Nations and what lesson that taught us, is that I'm not sure there's a great alternative, and I'm not sure there's a pathway to reform that could be effective. But we ought to take stock in the fact that the other pieces of the UN system, particularly those that are focused on human rights, actually has to date performed very well, has maximized the use of their power and authority. And the hope is that they will continue to do that as the conflict continues.
Thank you very much, Keith, for that overview and again for that sort of balanced perspective. I think, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, Security Council is the worst form of global governance except for all the others that have been tried. So, it is what it is, and I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit in the discussion. Looking back on some of the human rights violations and other sorts of violations, I'll now turn to Dr. Carrie McDougall for her perspective. Dr. McDougall.
Thanks, Andrew. Look, as much as I'm grateful to the Stimson Centre for the invitation to enjoy this panel, in being asked to comment on accountability, in some ways I feel like it's a bit of a fool's errand, because if we're talking about prosecuting perpetrators of serious international crimes, the UN, which is supposed to have refocused on prevention, has in many ways by definition failed. But I think if we take, a less literal approach to this question about fitness for purpose, I would in many ways echo the remarks of the other panelists. We can perhaps unpack this in Q&A, but as a starting premise, I think it's, fairly clear, at least in my assessment, that there is increasing evidence that war crimes and crimes against humanity have been committed in Ukraine. It is possible that genocide may have been committed. Of course, the legal definition of genocide sets a very high threshold on the basis of publicly available information. It's not clear that that threshold has been met, but I think it's certainly something that should be investigated. And I guess, like Richard and Ambassador Harper, what I'd say is what is being done in response to these, serious allegations of international crimes is actually, really in some ways quite remarkable. You've got Ukraine and a host of other states having announced the opening of domestic criminal investigations. More relevantly, for the purpose of today's topic, as mentioned in passing by Richard, after an unprecedented referral by 42 states parties, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has launched an investigation into crimes committed in the situation. We saw the ICC investigators deployed in country into the region almost immediately. We've seen the ICC being given additional financial and in-kind support by states parties to facilitate that investigation. And, I think that enormous investigative effort really does signal that it's highly likely that we'll see prosecutions for at least some serious international crimes committed in Ukraine. Now, the question I get asked when I talk about accountability in Ukraine is whether we'll see the likes of President Putin being prosecuted by the ICC. And I think the answer to that question is less clear. Under international criminal law, it's certainly possible for a puppet master to be held responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in the field. But we should be alive to the fact that proving the individual criminal responsibility of political leaders beyond reasonable doubt is an exceedingly difficult task. And it's in that context that I think it's really important to consider the crime of aggression. So for those less familiar with the crime, it makes individuals criminally responsible for state acts of aggression that by their character, gravity, and scale amount to a manifest violation of the prohibition of the use of force. Now, there's absolutely no plausible legal justification for Russia and Belarus's invasion of Ukraine. Their acts are a textbook example of the state act element of the crime. However, while the ICC has jurisdiction over war crimes, crimes against humanity, and any genocide committed on the territory of Ukraine by any perpetrators, regardless of their nationality, the ICC doesn't have jurisdiction currently over crimes of aggression committed in Ukraine because the ICC's jurisdiction over aggression is narrower compared to other Rome Statute crimes. That is effectively a political price paid for securing agreement on the aggression amendments. So relevantly, this means if the prosecutor tries to act on their own initiative or on the basis of a state referral, where an aggressor the court just doesn't have jurisdiction in the case of proprio motu investigations or state referrals, where an aggressor or victim state is not an ICC state party. And I think this, really matters for two reasons. The first is practical. The crime of aggression is by definition a leadership crime. It can only be committed by persons who control or direct the political or military action of a state. So frankly speaking, it would be much easier to establish the criminal responsibility of someone like President Putin or President Lukashenko compared to other crimes. The more significant reason, in my view, is that a prosecution for the crime of aggression would better capture the totality of the wrong that's been committed. So a prosecution for the crime of aggression would reflect the harm done not only to Ukrainian civilians, but also Ukrainian combatants who are lawful targets under international humanitarian law. As well, I might add to those members of the Russian and Belarusian armed forces who, by all accounts, have been forced to fight a war on false premises. It would also hold Putin and others to account for the violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and their attack on the international legal order. So what do we do if the ICC can't currently prosecute a crime of aggression committed against Ukraine? Well, on paper, the easiest way of overcoming that gap is to have the situation referred to the ICC by the Security Council. Now, of course, that's not going to happen because of the Russian veto. But even in the absence of a veto, I don't think we could count on the support of the US, the UK, and France, who have long opposed the exercise of the ICC's jurisdiction over aggression. There are a number of domestic investigations for aggression on foot. If you're interested, I can explain why in Q&A why a domestic prosecution is unlikely to succeed and is otherwise unwise. But if, in the interest of time, you can take my word for it for now. It means that if we're going to prosecute aggression, what we have to do is establish a new international tribunal. And in many ways, I think this initiative will put the UN and other multilateral institutions to the test. Because for a number of legal and political reasons, it would be preferable for such a tribunal to be established through an agreement between the Ukraine and the UN, approved by the General Assembly. And that path is being sounded out in New York. But my own current assessment is that there will be insufficient support for the requisite GA resolution, because accountability generally and aggression specifically remains a very sensitive subject. And so we'll likely have to look outside of the UN. So the proposed tribunal could be established under the auspices of the EU or even the Council of Europe. Alternatively, it could be established through a treaty. Again, these options are actively being considered and will be a subject of a conference next week in Lithuania. So if a tribunal is established outside of the UN, will it be proof that the UN is not fit for purpose? I think there are grounds for making that argument. At the same time, I think it is unrealistic to fail to accept that there's a limit to what the UN can achieve when faced by a recalcitrant P5 member. That problem is baked into the UN Charter. And for my money, I think rather than bemoaning the failures of the UN, I think it's actually more productive to welcome and applaud the commitment and creativity that's being demonstrated by the use of other elements of the international peace and security architecture, including looking beyond the UN for the establishment of a special tribunal on aggression for Ukraine.
Great, thank you very much, Carrie, for that broad overview. It does sort of give us a good sense of the possibilities out there. It also, of course, reminds me we don't know how this conflict is going to end, and how conflicts end, I think, have an important bearing as well on which one of those range of possibilities might be considered. So I look forward to a little more discussion about that. Our fourth panelist, Ambassador Milner from Slovakia. I'm not sure if he's on yet. He was going to be running a little bit late. Ambassador Milner, are you there yet? Okay, well, he is going to be with us shortly. I think what I'd like to do is turn to a question from me on this to start with, for the three of you at least, and then when Ambassador Milner joins us, he can make his opening presentation as well. But let me start again, exercising the moderator's privilege with my own question, because all of you have provided today some really insightful and comprehensive view of where the UN system has performed well and where it has fallen short of its own ambitions. But let me turn it around here, though, and ask whether the UN system has served the goals and interests of its principal national stakeholders, namely member states, because, of course, as many have said, that the UN really only can be as good as its individual member states. But if you look at their foreign policy goals and aspirations, has it, for example, been a net asset for US foreign policy? Where does the UN system leave China's careful calculus in this crisis? And has the UN system actually allowed Russia to escape even more severe consequences for its actions? So I'll leave it to any or all of the panelists to maybe tackle that one briefly in just a few minutes, and then we can go on to more questions. Richard, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, let me jump in with 2 points in response to that. Firstly, I think we should we should say that the US has played the diplomatic game at the UN pretty well. I think actually very well over the last 2 months. And, even recognizing the limitations of what the US could achieve here, we have definitely seen the US system coordinating extremely well around all the votes that we have mentioned, especially in the General Assembly. And we should add there's been extremely good EU-US cooperation. Now, I highlight that because that would not have been imaginable 2 years ago. 2 years ago, US-UN was basically a ship adrift, cut off from Washington by the Trump administration. US-EU coordination at the UN was in a hopeless state. And even leaving aside some quite interesting speculation about how President Trump would have responded to this war, I can assure you that the US diplomatic machine in New York would not have been able to get the sort of results it's getting today. And I think it shows that Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, Ambassador Crocker in Geneva, have got US diplomacy here back on track. So I think that's positive. The role of China is fascinating because we see a distinction between China's behavior in the real world and China's behavior at the UN. In the real world, most of the indications are that China is basically supporting Russia in this conflict. But at the UN, China is really hanging back. China had some pretty in-depth discussions with the US over its very initial attempt at a Security Council resolution condemning the war. The Chinese told the US what language they would need to have taken out of that resolution so they could abstain on it. The US did that deal. So China has abstained on the resolution condemning Russia in the Security Council. It's abstained on the resolutions condemning Russia in the General Assembly, and it abstained on the Human Rights Council resolution condemning Russia. China is very deliberately signaling that it actually doesn't want a big fight with the US over Ukraine at the UN. The one exception to that, which Keith mentioned, was China did vote against suspending Russia from the Human Rights Council, but of course it did, because China knows that for some time the US has been sort of using the UN as one place to put pressure on it over the Uyghur issue, and it doesn't want to create any precedents for its own suspension from the council over the treatment of the Uyghurs. But more generally, China has really been hanging back, and I think that tells us that China doesn't want this war to blow up the UN system. I think that's actually something that we should see as a relief, at least in the UN frame.
Great. Thank you very much, Richard. That's a great overview of some of the national interests at stake. Keith or Carrie, would you like to touch on this question?
Yeah, I would say I agree with Richard's statements. I would just one thing I would add, because I do think the point regarding the U.S. engagement and effective EU-U.S. collaboration, those are absolutely true. You don't get a vote like 140-5 in the General Assembly without really effective diplomacy. That's just not going to happen. And so that is I think notable. And so the system is working as the U.S. would like it to work. I think except for the Security Council. The other point, though, that I would add is that I think that the system is working for other member states as well. I mean, I think Singapore, I think it was the foreign minister, but a senior diplomat was basically saying we need these international rules because these international rules keeps a country like us safe and able to prosper. And so a lot of countries are seeing the value of the international rules-based order, I think, in a new and profound way, and is seeing that if Russia is able to just invade and take over Ukraine, there but for the grace of God go them, and that is not a prospect that other member states want to see have set a precedent. So,
yes, thank you. Carrie.
I would agree, but also maybe just observe that, of course, in the last 5 years or so, we've seen this rise of nationalism and popularism, and in some ways, people have feared a slow death of democracy, and as a result, a real weakening of multilateralism. So, one thing I think that Russia hadn't counted on is the extent to which at least the West would be galvanized into unified opposition against it. And I think there is some hope that this, will lead to a revitalization or a reinvigoration of multilateralism, not least for the reason that Ambassador Harper just noted. States depend on the prohibition of the use of force for their national security, or at least most states do. And I think we have seen a reemergence of the leadership of WEOG within the UN, but I think we also do need to pay, really careful attention to the fact that outside of that really overwhelming first vote in the General Assembly of 141-5, there is not, in fact, total unity there. And I think, the foreign policy interests of countries like the US and Australia would, in fact, be well served by trying to do more to galvanize additional international unity. So I think, pressure should be on certain African states, certain Asian states in particular, to really stand united with other members of the international community in opposing Russia's actions.
Thank you. Let's turn to some questions now from the audience. And let me start with one, actually, Richard, for you. It's a couple of questions I have that are on the same topic from Brian Heilman and Max Kovaloff. And the question is, what are the chances of bringing UN peacekeepers to Ukraine at some point? And can the deployment of peacekeepers be authorized by the UN General Assembly, or does the Security Council have exclusive power in this question?
So again, this is something that Crisis Group has written on, and again, I will put a link to everyone in the chat. We wrote a piece now over a month ago called A Tentative First Look at Options for Peace Operations in Ukraine. I think we should have extended that title even more. A tentative, hypothetical, extremely cautious first look would have been a better moniker. The reason that we're tentative is that we don't believe that we should start designing peace operations without having a clearer sense of what peace they would try to keep. Ultimately, you need a peace agreement, or at least a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. You need to believe that that is a settlement that both sides have signed on to with some good faith. And then you can start thinking about what operational mechanisms you need to make that cessation of hostilities stick. I think it's clear that under no circumstances are we going to be talking about a large-scale Blue Helmet operation of the type we currently have in Congo or in southern Lebanon. You simply cannot find countries that will want to put their soldiers on the front line with a risk of getting into some sort of shooting incident with the Russians. It's just not credible. But what you could imagine, and what we describe in the piece, is a lighter weight observation mission that would be there to help Russian and Ukrainian forces disengage, to deal with any unintended flare-ups between them, and to reassure the Ukrainians in particular, I think, that Russia sticks by the terms of any ceasefire or peace deal that it makes. So lightweight observation of a very classic type is a possibility. Because the battlefront is very long, the monitors would need helicopters, they would need mobility. But, again, one shouldn't get too far into the details at this point. Could the General Assembly mandate something of this type? I mean, yes, the General Assembly in the past has mandated peacekeeping operations, as over Suez in '56. But realistically, you can't put peacekeepers on the ground in front of Russian forces unless Russia agrees to have them there. And if Russia agrees to have them there, Russia will agree to a resolution in the Security Council mandating. So the idea of the General Assembly trying to mandate a peace operation over the head of the Security Council is just unrealistic, because the Russians have some very direct ways to to block that sort of deployment, regardless of UN structures.
Yeah, I think that'll be another situation where how the war ends, I think, will have a critical influence on what any kind of follow-up force might look like or could even exist. I have a question here for Carrie from Tom Butelaar, and he asks. He points out the West is rightfully focusing on war crimes committed in Ukraine, but it has also fast-tracked investigations in other contexts in the past, such as in Libya. To what degree is there a risk of politicization of the International Criminal Court, and if so, what could be done about it?
I might be a bit biased as an international lawyer who's also a former diplomat, but I don't think you can untangle international law and politics. They're inherently interwoven. I don't think you can identify a situation under investigation or prosecution before the ICC that isn't highly political. I mean, we only have to look at some of the decisions and developments in relation to other situations like Georgia or Afghanistan. So I think pretending that the ICC doesn't have to do with political issues is a little bit unrealistic. I think that the one criticism that I think has teeth is the notion of selectivity. That we are prioritizing an investigation into Ukraine because of the international response to Russia and Belarus's invasion, in a way that we haven't seen the same priority given to victims of crimes in places like Syria and Yemen, who, apart from a handful of domestic universal jurisdiction, prosecutions are largely still waiting for justice. And I think that is a valid criticism, and it is one that could potentially undermine or weaken the international criminal justice project. My own view is that we can't let perfect be the enemy of good. If we wait for justice until we can deliver justice perfectly everywhere, we're never going to see any victims get justice. And I think that will only embolden megalomaniacs who hold huge amounts of power to commit more crimes. So I think we can acknowledge selectivity and the shortcomings and continue to work for more universal justice, while still pursuing the justice that is within our reach. And currently it looks like that will be possible in relation to crimes committed in Ukraine.
Yes, thank you. You highlight something that I know in preparation for this seminar, I also have been thinking about, that we have to be careful not to be too Western centric in the view of this conflict being, so much worse than all the others we've experienced over the last decades, just because it's, so much on our Twitter feeds and screens, and it's part of the Western world. So I think that also, as you point out, feeds into international criminal prosecutions and crimes of aggression. Let me turn, Keith, to you. I have a question here from Alexandra Gorlick, who asks, she says, for some people, the West policies since the end of the Cold War are also responsible for this war. Would you agree that it's only through maintaining a certain balance of power in the Security Council that the UN can truly fulfill its purpose?
I don't. I think that the purpose of the Security Council, the purpose of the UN is to be a manifestation of the international rules-based order. If you believe that the international community, that the community of states should be regulated by a set of norms, then there has to be an institution created that aids you in that regulation, or else you should just not. You should have a kind of might is right kind of world. But I think that what was determined after 2 world wars is that type of world is unstable, insecure, and does not set the foundation for prosperity. So with all of its flaws, with all of its with all the violations of the international rules-based order, to have that order is still vitally important. If countries don't support that international rules-based order, like Russia doesn't, clearly, then we ought not have a balance with them. They should not be empowered. They're violators and vitiators of the fundamentals and the fundamental principles of what the entirety of the system is based on. And that cannot be rewarded, that cannot be empowered. So no, I don't think a balance is the key. I don't know what the key is to the Security Council. I think that maybe it doesn't work in certain circumstances. And as Dr. McDougall was saying, we just have to accept that fact. That doesn't mean think about any system of rules. Think about domestically the criminal justice system. The fact that the criminal justice system does not work in each and every instance there is a murder or some other heinous crime doesn't mean you get rid of the criminal justice system. You figure out ways to improve it over time so that it obtains justice and it stands up for the normative framework. Well, that's the exact same thing with the international community. The fact that it fails in certain instances shouldn't mean that we abandon the experiment. It means that we try to find ways to improve it over time. I do want to say one thing on the ICC, because I'm certainly not an expert like others are on that. But I will tell you, as I served as a diplomat for WEOG country, I heard time and time again from African ambassadors just how much they thought the ICC was a tool for punishing Africa and African leadership. And this is a sign, on the other side of the scale, this is a sign that we're also bringing to justice non-African countries. And so I think that's actually healthy for the ICC.
I think that's a very valuable point, Keith. Thank you. Let me pose a follow-up question, really, for any of the panelists. It was originally intended for Ambassador Milner, who I'm told will be with us shortly. But I'd like to get it out there because I think it follows this up very nicely, and it's from Nishanta Ben, and it references a recent General Assembly resolution led by Liechtenstein that would put in place a mechanism to trigger a UN General Assembly debate every time a veto is cast in the Security Council. The resolution also mandates that a report be submitted by the Security Council to the General Assembly before the General Assembly debates on the use of the veto. The question is if this resolution is adopted, what impact do you think it would have on future use of the veto? And how can member states maximize this opportunity to curb the misuse of the veto? Richard, I see a hand up.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, this is an excellent initiative by Liechtenstein. It's an idea that's been floating around for a while. And I think that it is a smart tactic to sort of raise the reputational cost of using a veto. And I think it's also very striking that the US, which has never previously supported any initiative relating to veto restraint, has decided to back this up. Will it affect Russia's calculations? Probably not, to be quite honest. Vitaly Churkin, the previous Russian ambassador here, had a party trick by which he could list every single veto he'd cast and explain, in actually sort of pretty convincing terms, why he thought every single veto was necessary. And I'm pretty sure that if we sort of get this resolution today, I think it's being voted on right now or later today, the Russians will come to the General Assembly and, use their veto regardless and have sort of, reasons for it, however fallacious. It's going to be interesting for the US because the US doesn't use its veto these days as often as Russia or China, but it does use its veto to defend Israel. And so one question that came up in diplomacy around this initiative was, will the Americans mind having to go and explain their vetoes over Israel to the General Assembly? The answer is no, of course not. It's great if you're a US ambassador to be able to go to the General Assembly, stand up and say you're defending Israel. It plays incredibly well. So actually the US are quite looking forward to having to put this mechanism into action. Lastly, though, I think the one country that it does affect because to be quite frankly, the UK and France gave up vetoing at the end of the Cold War, is China. And China does actually really hate the reputational costs of using its veto, especially if it's ever forced to do so without Russia co-vetoing with it. I do think that the Chinese who've always been more cautious about using their veto than the Russians, will see this as one more reason they would prefer not to not to use that privilege very often. That said, there are some people who argue that the US or UK should now try and force the Chinese into a veto position over Myanmar, so that it has to explain that to the General Assembly. I would be a little cautious about that. I think that if following this initiative, the US and UK sort of run around trying to get China and Russia to veto on lots of things, it will look spurious, and it will go down badly with the General Assembly.
Thank you. Would either of the other panelists like to touch on this?
Maybe just add that, in these moments of crisis, I think you inevitably get commentary about, the need to reform the Security Council's membership, or, is Russia the genuine inheritor of the USSR seat? And, at least in my assessment, some of those proposals are just unrealistic in terms of anything that would require amendment of the UN Charter. But, initially this proposal was meant to be considered, I think, in March 2020. So it's not a direct response to the current crisis. But I think it does show not only are states thinking cleverly about increasing the reputational cost of using the veto, but they're thinking about how do we amend or change the working methods of the council itself, and how do we use the other organs of the membership more effectively. So, one vote in the General Assembly are of equal value. And I think, over time we are becoming more creative about how to use the General Assembly's admittedly more limited powers. But I'm sort of reminded of the establishment of the AAAM for Syria. Now, it has limited powers. It can't prosecute crimes because of that inherent difference between the GA's lack of enforcement powers compared to the council. But, that body is still doing incredibly important work, and it could very much result in prosecutions that will be carried out by other courts and tribunals, be they domestic, regional, or ultimately international. So, I think there's real merit to this proposal, and, kudos to Liechtenstein to adding yet another initiative to try and make the UN more fit for purpose.
Thank you. Maybe zooming out a bit on that, because I think in some ways that's obviously a change that can be done within the current system as we have it now. A number of questions in the chat are focused a bigger, longer term question about UN reform. And Ted Daly, for example, from Los Angeles, references President Zelensky's comment quite recently about dissolving the UN. And he said to the U.S. Congress that the wars of the past have prompted our predecessors to create institutions that should protect us from war, but unfortunately they won't work. So we need new institutions, says President Zelensky. So what are we to make of this remarkable rhetoric, and how might we use it to advance the UN reform agenda on which so many of us have worked for so many years? So I don't think this is about sort of tearing everything up and sort of saying, what would we do if we started with a blank slate? But it's sort of saying, okay, but let's think a little bit bigger than what can be done within the current rules and constraints. I guess I'll add my own kind of question on it for you, which is what would be the one or two kind of specific reform priorities, maybe that are reasonably member states might look at and approve, that could be brought to the UN in the next year or two, medium term, that would help address some of the shortcomings we're touching on today. And that's open to any panelists who wants to touch on it. That's a big one, I realize, but you can take one piece or the other of that as you see fit. Richard.
I'll risk going first. Look, firstly, let's make one point about what Zelensky said, which is that I think we've all been, as you say, sort of offering glass half full interpretations of what the current system is doing. I think that's justified objectively. But if I were President Zelensky, or if I was any Ukrainian, I would be completely unconvinced by every single word so far in this seminar. Because yes, the UN, the Security Council, has failed Ukraine. And as Carrie said at the start, it's interesting and important to think about new accountability mechanisms, but you're only thinking about accountability because the UN failed in its fundamental purpose of preventing this war. So I understand why Zelensky and a lot of his advisors have been extremely negative towards the UN over the last 2 months, and also why they're talking about ripping up the rule book and starting over. I actually don't think, stepping back, that this is a propitious moment to try and rip up the rule book. I don't think that we're in a situation comparable to 1945 where all the major powers are willing to think about massive organizational redesign. To touch on another question that was in the Q&A, I don't think this is even a good moment for an Article 109 conference on major charter revisions, because major charter revisions require assent from all of the P5, and Russia is not going to give its assent to any charter revisions, even if they are sort of worked out through an Article 109 conference. In terms of what the UN could do better, I would actually highlight something more on the humanitarian and global side of the conflict, which is last year, with a lot of support from Stimson, and in fact your colleague Richard Ponzio takes a lot of credit for this, Guterres put out a report called Our Common Agenda. And Our Common Agenda is essentially Guterres' vision of multilateralism after COVID. And one of the things he argues is that in a connected world, shocks like COVID have massive ripple effects on societies, on economies, and you need some sort of new body parallel to the Security Council to sort of handle the economic fallout of these massive global shocks. It's called an emergency platform. It isn't yet very well defined. But interestingly, because the Ukraine war has global ramifications on food prices, energy, and so on, Guterres has basically set up an ad hoc emergency platform, a special team working on how the IFIs and how governments can respond to food issues, energy issues. And so in real time, we're sort of seeing the SG put this idea of a new international sort of emergency coordination mechanism into action. And I think that's something we should work on sort of formalizing and building up, because if the Security Council is going to be paralyzed, you can't replace it, but you can have something separate in the UN system that sort of brings really high level coordination to managing global crises like these. And we're sort of seeing it being built on the hoof.
That's great. Thank you, Richard. I see that Ambassador Milner has now joined us, and so I will turn the floor over to him for his comments. Please, Ambassador Milner, welcome.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and sincere greetings to all distinguished colleagues and everybody who is following us. Apologies for complicating the schedule a little bit, but these are very challenging and trying times for all of us, including how we manage our schedules. So I apologize that I wasn't able to hear what the discussion started with, but just listening to Richard now in relation to UN reform already gives me a bit of a flavor, and I certainly would react that UN reform is long overdue, including and in particular the reform of the UN Security Council. I am an internal optimist, and of course, things are very complicated, but I would like to see this whole crisis as hopefully a new opportunity for us to revisit the UN reform related issues, in particular, also in relation to the Security Council. And let's see what and how we can proceed in that regard. I am not usually much in favor of creating new platforms or new mechanisms if we have not exhausted all our efforts in improving the current ones, because that would be erosion of the system as we have it. And we often have that tendency: if something doesn't work, let's create something new. It may be one of the options, but I think we owe it to ourselves and to the people of the world that we do our absolutely best to improve and reform the system. We haven't really exhausted all the options, I believe. And let's see, of course, later we may be confronted with doing something more. And you know that already earlier we had proposals about what to do with the trusteeship council. And of course, we created the Peace Building Commission and the Human Rights Council. These were very important steps, and I think we can still even today learn a lot from how that happened. Of course, the context and the circumstances are a little bit different. We are facing probably the most serious crisis in the area of international peace and security since the Second World War. So we have to face it, but crisis mode hopefully will lead to additional commitments or additional willingness and hopefully also ability to do something more. And let's remind ourselves also that the UN is not some esoteric power that exists above all of us. The UN actually is only as good as we collectively, as the UN member states, make it. So the UN is us, and of course it is still in our collective power to do more. The Security Council has failed Ukraine. That's a clear fact. And you know, the fact that an aggressor state is able to use its veto to stop any Security Council action in this important case is really unacceptable. There is nothing else that I can say about that. So of course, for that reason, the subsequent action by the UN General Assembly was even more important. And I'm sure you have already mentioned that the strong majority of 141 or 140 member states that have clearly expressed their views and their positions in regard to the Russian aggression speaks for itself, and it's a strong indication of what we can do if we work very closely together. And another important factor is that there was really a lot of efforts that have been invested into making sure that as many of us as possible are on the same page, that as many of us as possible are engaged and involved. There was really very intense outreach and important work together. And of course, that has to continue. That's one of the key lessons that I think we should learn from the current situation. And that also, at least briefly, brings me also to the UN General Assembly revitalization process. Previously, this is something which was seen as a more cosmetic or more technocratic exercise. But the important role that the General Assembly has recently had to play in relation to the war in Ukraine is yet another strong reminder of the importance of the General Assembly, where all of us are permanent members and all of us are equal. And it is the most important and most democratic decision-making and deliberative organ of the United Nations. So we have ways, and we do have means through the revitalization process how to even further refine its working methods and its involvement in important situations like that. By saying that, I by no means want to say that we should ignore the Security Council or that we should give up on the Security Council. Definitely not. But through our concerted efforts in the General Assembly, I believe we can make it clear also to the Security Council members and to the whole world that there are ways and means how things can be done. Of course, there is still a lot more that should be done. There is still a lot more that we could do. But as I said already, I am an eternal optimist, and I do believe that if we see the situation from the glass half full perspective, we can build up on what has already happened in the General Assembly with 141/140, and what actually will be happening in a couple of minutes when we take a decision on an important General Assembly resolution related to the use of veto. And I have heard a bit earlier during the press conference that Secretary General Guterres just had in Moscow with Foreign Minister Lavrov. Foreign Minister Lavrov speaking himself that Russia is willing to participate in this process, and that they are willing to give their reasoning or give their explanations in the cases when they use the veto. So it seems to me like something that indicates that we are going in the right direction with this particular initiative that has been so far co-sponsored by more than 70 UN member states, including Slovakia, of course, and we hope that it will be an important contribution to bringing back our attention to the way the whole setup is arranged, also in relations between the Security Council and the General Assembly, and that it will do its part in that context. As you know, it was not specifically designed as a result of the war in Ukraine, because this is an initiative that has been going on for about 2 years. And of course, the situation in Ukraine further made it clear that it is necessary and that we should join forces collectively and do it. It's not really exactly what I envisaged as my opening statement, but I thought that it would be probably more useful to rather than doing a formal one, which is here in front of me, also in the written format, but I thought that it would probably be more relevant and more useful to offer a few comments in such a way. And of course, I will be more than happy to come back with any additional points or any replies. Thank you, and to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. And for somebody who missed the early part of the discussion, you picked up on a lot of the themes that we did cover. So we thank you very much, and it was very great to hear from you, and particularly, of course, given that you represent a country that borders Ukraine and therefore faces some unique and special challenges, as we know. I have a couple of questions for you. I know there are other questions. We're going to be running a little short on time, however. I'd like to first maybe invite any of the other panelists, if they'd like to comment or ask you a question related to what you just said or other topics that we've covered. I will give them the chance to do that. and I didn't warn them I was going to do that, so that's a little bit of a surprise. I will just maybe let me jump in then and just ask a related question. I think that has come up a bit in the chat and the questions, and I'd be interested to hear, Mr. Ambassador, your thoughts on this and other panelists. But the UN has always had a evolving relationship, shall we say, with regional organizations in terms of how it divides up responsibility, how it divides up competencies. I'd be interested in your view of how, in particular in this case, where we have at least four overlapping regional organizations, the Council of Europe, NATO, the EU, and the OSCE, how you feel that relationship has worked between the UN at the global level and those regional organizations, and where gaps have emerged. Again, Ambassador, if you have thoughts to start with, and then other panelists would want to touch on that.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Absolutely, these partnerships are absolutely vital and critical. They have always been, not least because of Chapter 8 of the UN Charter. But in particular, in the area of international peace and security, it is often the regional or even the sub-regional organizations. And of course, as you know, I'm speaking here about African sub-regional organizations in particular, such as ECOWAS or IGAD, SADC, and others. So, you know, all these have really played a crucial role in addressing also the peace and security challenges worldwide. In this particular context, of course, it is primarily the OSCE. It's not easy because, as we know, OSCE takes all its decisions by consensus, and even when one party or one participating state says no, then the OSCE is blocked. And as you know, there was no agreement about the continuation of the SMM, the special monitoring mission that the OSCE had in Ukraine, and it played an extremely important role, and of course acted in many ways also for and on behalf of the UN. So we need to continue engaging with our regional and sub-regional organizations in this particular context, but also in many others. And we are investing a lot of energy and effort into these partnerships, whether it's on counterterrorism, on issues such as security sector governance and reform, on peace processes, participation of important stakeholders, including civil society, women, and youth. In peace building. So, you know, there is a long list of practical work that is being done, and of course some of it may not necessarily always be visible, but that's not necessarily such a problem, because a lot of these efforts are actually more productive when they are done somehow off the radar screen, when they are done quietly and in confidence. So that's fine. Maybe we need to also, in the aftermath of the current crisis, we need to better design the engagement mechanisms, because some of them are a bit stiff. And I am also referring to, some of the cooperation agreements that the UN has with the regional and sub-regional organizations, or the kind of schematic or bureaucratic formats that prevail. We need to, I believe, design more flexible and meaningful platforms for that. We can and we should share some lessons learned. But I can also say that, for example, as EU ambassadors, we don't take these things for granted, and we have been engaging a lot with our African Union colleagues. So it is also this cross-pollination among the regional organizations that can then inform the wider UN processes. So that's yet another contributing factor to making these partnerships successful. My own professional motto has been 3 Ps: starts with people, obviously, because we should never lose the people's perspective. And the war in Ukraine is a strong reminder of just that. Second is participation, because we need to be involved and we need to actively play our roles. And third is partnerships. So of course, it goes very much in the same direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Any of the other panelists would like to either raise a point or address that question? We've just got a couple of minutes left. Okay, well, great. Well, listen, I guess we'll wrap it up at this point. We've run over time as it is, but really grateful for all of you to be here, to join us for this conversation. I thank the audience for its participation as well, and the excellent questions. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to many of them. The really good, thoughtful responses to what we heard from our panelists. I think quite obviously, one thing I've certainly taken away from this is that this is a conversation that we need to keep having. This is not a one-off. This is not a snapshot by any means. Things will change, and we would like to build on this and follow up. So we will be looking to do looking for further opportunities, I think, for dialogue, discussion as things develop, both here at the UN, but also in Ukraine. And I want to thank each one of the panelists for your thoughtful presentations and your commentary. And I look forward to being in touch. And thank you to the audience. Goodbye.